Good day. So the topic is about risk management. So when we say risk management, it's about whether it may or may not happen is the basic definition of risk. So we'll try to talk about risk table. A risk table provides a project manager with a simple technique for risk projection. It consists of five columns: risk summary, that is short description about the risk category, one of seven risk categories, probability, estimation of the risk occurrence based on group input, impact. There are various impact, that is, one risk can be catastrophic or critical or marginal or negligible. So RMM is pointed to a paragraph in the risk mitigation monitoring and management plan. So RMM stands for risk mitigation, monitoring and management. So developing a risk table, what is the significance of this? So here you will list all the risks in the first column by the way of the help of the risk item checklist. Then you mark the category of each risk. After you mark the category, you estimate the probability of each risk. That is, to what extent may occur. What is the percentage of that? After that, you assess the impact of each risk based on an averaging of the four risk components to determine an overall impact value. That is, whether it is catastrophic or negligible or marginal. Sort the rows by probability and impact in descending order. That is, to what extent the particular risk needs to be attended towards and prioritized. Then finally, you draw a horizontal cutoff line on the table that indicates the risks that will be given further attention towards. So with the risk table created and you try to understand assessing the risk impact. So three factors affect the consequences that are likely if a risk does occur. Its nature. This indicates the problems that are likely if the risk occurs. So its scope. This combines the severity of the risk, how serious was it, with its overall distribution, how much was affected, then its timing, that is when and for how long the impact will be felt. So these three factors will affect the consequence, the nature, scope, and timing. So the overall risk exposure formula is risk exposure is equal to P into C. P is the probability of occurrence for a risk. C is the cost to the project should the risk actually occur. So let us take an example here. P, that is probability of occurrence for a risk, that is 80% probability that 18 of 60 software components will have to be developed. C, that is the total cost of developing 18 components is 25,000. So with 80% of probability and $25,000, we can calculate the risk exposure, which is 0.80 into 25,000, which is 20,000. So the risk exposure is $20,000. So RMM, that is risk mitigation, monitoring and management, it's an effective strategy for dealing with risk and must consider these three aspects. They are not mutually exclusive. So risk mitigation, that is avoidance, risk monitoring, risk management and contingency planning. Risk mitigation, that is avoidance, is the primary strategy and is achieved through a plan. For instance, we can say the risk of high staff turnover. So how can you take steps to avoid? So these are the possible options, strategy that you can follow for reducing the staff turnover. So meet with the current staff to determine causes for the turnover. That is, if there are any poor conditions or working conditions, if there is a low pay that's being provided, and if there is a competitive job market. So to what extent can you try to cover that? So mitigate those causes that are under the control before the project starts. Once the project commences, assume turnover will occur. Develop techniques to ensure continuity when people leave. So that is how you manage or mitigate a particular risk. So organize the project team so that information about each development activity is widely dispersed. Define documentation standards and establish mechanisms to ensure that documents are developed in a timely manner. Conduct peer reviews of all work. Assign a backup staff member for every critical technologies. So these are some of the strategies that you can follow in order to mitigate that particular risk of reducing staff turnover. So during the risk monitoring, the project manager monitors factors that may provide an indication of whether a risk is becoming more or less likely. Risk management and contingency planning assume that mitigation efforts have failed and that the risk has become a reality. So RMM steps incur additional project cost. Large projects may have identified 30 to 40 risks. Risk is not limited to the software project itself. Risk can occur after the software has been delivered to the user. The software safety and hazard analysis. These are software quality assurance activities that focus on the identification and assessment of potential hazards that may affect software negatively and cause an entire system to fail. If hazards can be identified early in the software process, then it can be specified that will either eliminate or control the potential hazards. So the RMM plan may be a part of the software development plan or maybe a separate document. Once RMM, that is risk mitigation, monitoring and management, has been documented and the project has begun, the risk mitigation and monitoring steps will begin. Risk mitigation is a problem avoidance activity. Risk monitoring is a project tracking activity. So risk monitoring has three objectives. That is to assess whether predicted risks do in fact occur, to ensure that risk aversion steps defined for the risk are being properly applied, to collect information that can be used for future risk analysis. The findings from risk monitoring may allow the project manager to ascertain what risks caused which problems throughout the project. So the 7 principles of risk management. So beginning with maintaining a global perspective. So view software risks within the context of a system and the business problem that is intended to solve. So the risks, the software risks that are listed in the risk table, which is very specific to the system and the business that it's going to impact, the problem that it's going to create. Take a forward looking view. So think about the risks that may arise in the future, establish contingency plans. So the team will need to clearly understand these are the possible risks that may occur. That prediction will need to be properly done so that appropriate plans can be created. That is, the backup plan needs to be clearly established so that you are able to have appropriate mitigation for that, or how exactly you can manage that particular risk. Next is to encourage open communication. That is, all stakeholders will need to be encouraged and users as well to point out risks at any time. So the team will need to be clearly allowing the stakeholders and the users to point out risks at any time so that you know options from various perspectives and according plans can be made in order to keep things in place. Integrate risk management. Integrate the consideration of risk into the software process. This is extremely vital, a point that needs to be taken into consideration because many teams do not have this proper risk table and they do not have all the risks with the probability and the impact they create, and they don't prioritize that properly. If that is being done, then there is very less probability of a project being delayed or failing to deliver. Next is to emphasize a continuous process of risk management. So modify identified risks as more becomes known and add new risks as better insight is achieved. So just listing out the risks at the initial stage of the project and stopping is not the right approach. It is extremely vital to list out the risks as and when it's identified, even during the project progress, because that will help the team to understand if the process is being followed properly and taken ahead. Next is to develop a shared product vision. A shared vision by all stakeholders facilitates better risk identification and appropriate assessment. So the team that is including all the stakeholders will need to have a specific product vision so that you know the direction that the team is traveling towards, and also appropriate risk will need to be identified and taken ahead. If there are any assessment involved, that can also be completed and made sure the risk is managed properly. Finally, encouraging the teamwork when managing risk. So pool the skills and experience of all stakeholders when conducting such management activities. So the teamwork will need to be encouraged so that you know what are all the possible risks. And it's extremely vital that you manage that particular risk as a complete team. Because working as a team will clearly make you plan and mitigate or list out the risks and mitigate those risks if it happens. So it is very important. The team will have to sit and discuss and encourage that communication about if there are any problems and how exactly that particular risk can be managed accordingly. So with that said, you can see the 7 principles of risk management. It is beginning with maintaining a global perspective, taking a forward-looking view to encourage open communication, integrating the risk management, emphasize a continuous process of risk management, develop a shared product vision, finally, to encourage teamwork when managing risk. So with that said, we come to the conclusion of this particular topic about risk management, wherein we discussed about the risk table and then how exactly you can do the categorizing of the risks and the different impacts and prioritizing them, and how do you manage that risk with the entrepreneur. So for additional information, you can refer this text. Thank you.